Star Rail version 3 has continued the trend of character kits becoming increasingly more complex. From 3.0 to 3.4, the limited 5 stars average 548 words per kit, including all of the abilities and major ascension traces. That's really close to 3 times the amount of words in Zila's, who was the game's first banner 5-star. This always felt kind of inevitable, as in order to make new characters unique and exciting, HoYo kind of has to make them more complex with additional features. In fact, in my last video, I praised Finon's gameplay design, which was only possible thanks to how creative the developers were in implementing so many interesting things. So I was at a point where I felt like I just had to accept that abilities were going to continue to become more difficult to understand with time. I mean, to give credit where it's due, the devs have done their best to make kits more digestible with the brief description toggle, even though sometimes it does oversimplify, better character trials, and the Keeping Up with Star Rail YouTube series providing breakdowns, so they are aware that new players could be overwhelmed with the huge walls of text that modern abilities have started to have. Now imagine my surprise when the Fate characters finally arrive in Star Rail after a year of waiting, being hyped up as the game's first ever collaboration units, and their kits are short. To put it in perspective, Archer has less words than Jing Yuan, who was the game's second ever banner 5-star, and Saber has less than every version 3 5-star except for Trivi. Intuitively, you might even think this wouldn't be enough text to make these characters stand out from the rest of the cast, but their designs are actually very well thought out. These two characters prove that gameplay design can be simple yet effective, even 2 years into Honkai Star Rail's lifespan. Let's break down how the devs were able to pull it off. Let's start with Archer, who is on your account if you logged in, whether you like it or not. He can be summed up as a DPS unit who generates extra skill points with follow-up attacks and then is able to unload insane amounts of single target damage all at once by using as many skill points as possible. He unfortunately makes my previous video about the decline in skill point design age much worse, but regardless, I'm glad they finally returned to this archetype with a damage dealer who is truly able to make it work. As a skill point based DPS, Archer's skill is naturally the most important part of his kit. It uniquely costs 2 skill points to activate, doing single target damage, and crucially not ending the current turn. At this point, you can choose to end the turn, or continue spending skill points 2 at a time to launch additional attacks. To further build on this playstyle, his damage stacks with each consecutive attack, doing an additional 100% damage on the second and third. And thanks to his 6th ascension trace, if you're able to launch that many attacks, you'll also be getting a free 120% crit damage in the process. Naturally, this mechanic is strong because it means you can do more damage per turn, but it also makes his game plan completely unique from any other DPS by virtue of what resources he needs in battle. Other attackers really want speed because they can only do 1 action per turn, making the number of turns the limiting factor for their damage. This even applies to previous skill point hungry DPS units. Archer, on the other hand, can't make the most of his turns unless he has tons of skill points at his disposal, so he much prefers raw damage stats over speed, which is typically considered the best stat in the game. Also, if you fully action advance him, you almost certainly won't have enough skill points available for him to ramp up his damage, making him a rare instance of a hyper carry that uniquely doesn't care for Sunday as a partner. This method of attacking is also quite easy to use because it prevents you from accidentally spending way more skill points than you actually need. Chingchue's RNG tiles are of course quite bad in terms of that for obvious reasons, but one thing which would often be rather inconvenient with Danheng IL was not knowing how many skill points were needed to finish off a low health enemy. You kind of had to just guess and hope you either didn't waste skill points or waste your turn by not using enough. Although Archer does use 2 skill points per attack, having the entire turn be segmented rather than bending all of them at the start allows for much more flexible decision making. So already, Archer's skill sets a good foundation that is a clear step up from previous skill point DPSs while also capitalizing on what makes it different. But where the true genius is with how this idea was further expanded into a fully fleshed out kit. One of the talking points of my previous video was that since every support nowadays is slightly skill point positive or neutral, it makes skill points feel trivial to play around. Well, being able to spend up to 10 in a single turn certainly changes things, but it would have probably been a bit too difficult to have to deal with if Archer didn't have his own ways of offsetting this drawback. Skill points as a concept are intended to be punishing. When you mess up and don't refresh that crucial buff for an entire cycle of attacks, it feels quite bad. This applies even more so to damage dealers who need a lot of skill points to perform optimally. Meanwhile, certain other characters are able to fire off skills as they please, only sacrificing a portion of their massive HP pools. Archer is able to offset this inherent weakness in two ways. The first is that his second Ascension trace does something I would previously have been confident in saying the Star Rail devs would never do, which is put Sparkle's talent on another character. When Archer is on the field, the maximum skill point limit increases by 2. This is the most unique aspect of Sparkle's entire kit that felt groundbreaking when she released in 2.0 as a way to use her ultimate's 4 generated skill points without waste, so the natural initial reaction is to think this power creeps her, at least in some capacity. But because they are two units with completely different roles, Archer's design isn't overstepping. Even though he generates extra skill points, his design doesn't let him provide them for teammates because he absolutely needs them for himself, unlike Sparkle. Furthermore, since this utility is additive, Archer actually really wants Sparkle as a partner to get a max of 9 skill points, increasing Sparkle's value by quite a bit. Sparkle also happens to have a bonus attack buff that scales with more quantum allies on the team, which is a pretty outdated restriction by today's archetype focused standard, but at least it works out nicely for Archer, and there are plenty of good options for that third member. Normally, I'm not a huge fan of units getting such a significant power boost from a particular partner, but Archer is free, and there is a 4-star alternative in Honkai at the very least, who was also available for free from multiple past events. The second way Archer alleviates his reliance on skill points is with his talent, which launches a follow-up after the simple trigger of any ally attacking an enemy. Doing so recovers 1 skill point, which is certainly very powerful, but is limited by the number of charges Archer has. He gains 1 at the start of battle from his technique, another from his 4th Ascension trace, and 2 after launching his ultimate. The 220 energy cost may sound steep at first, but makes a lot of sense when you realize he gets the full 30 energy every time he launches an attack from his skill, so his energy generation rate is much higher than other characters. I can see why they went about it this way instead of giving him a lower ult cost and lower energy for additional skills, because it means he is much better off using skill points to build ult with his own abilities rather than relying on allies for energy, unlike some other units. Overall, Archer is a modern take on the skill point reliant DPS, being much more consistent and easy to use compared to his predecessors, while still fully embracing what makes the archetype different. And despite sacrificing some text to implement quality of life, with follow-ups still proccing even if the target dies, and enforcing limits like maxing out his skill at 5 uses in the future case of infinite skill points, his kit is truly straight to the point. There's also a clear line for him to get indirectly buffed in the future with more skill point oriented support, which is always great for longevity's sake. Saber has a bit more going on in her kit, but is still relatively straightforward once you understand what the design is going for. In contrast to Archer, it has a greater focus on ultimates. This all starts with her talent, which states that when any ally uses an ultimate, Saber gets 60% increased damage for 2 turns and gets 3 points of a unique resource called Core Resonance, which can be consumed to get a fixed 8 energy for Saber per point. She also gets 1 at the start of battle, plus 2 more from her technique. If Saber has enough points to where her ult would be charged, these points are consumed when Saber uses her skill, which is otherwise a basic blast targeted damaging ability that generates 3 points. When the effect triggers, the skill damage is increased by 14% for each. Because her abilities are geared towards her ultimate, it only makes sense that it is very powerful. Coming in at a 360 energy cost, it is the new most expensive ultimate in the game, just barely beating out Aglaia by 10 energy. The attack deals damage to all enemies, plus an additional 10 instances of damage to random enemies for an insane total of 1380% of Saber's attack. It also makes her next action forced to be her enhanced basic attack, which deals damage to all enemies, but even more when facing a fewer amount. As a destruction path character, the targeting of Saber's abilities are as expected, able to handle both waves of enemies and single bosses fairly well. Saber is now the first character with an energy based ultimate that is able to partially overstack on it, thanks to her 4th Ascension trace giving enough leeway for a third of her max energy pool. This means you can hold off on using her ult to wait for a certain window or to refresh buffs without being heavily punished, and there's also a visual indicator, which is a nice touch. Characters with high reliance on their ultimates are nothing new to Star Rail, but her teams are actually quite a bit more forgiving than you'd expect. Saber gets a good amount of free stats from her kit, with 35% attack for 2 turns after using her technique, an unconditional 20% crit rate from her 2nd Ascension trace, and a total of 82% crit damage from her A6 once ramped up. This means that she'll do fine with just about any damage boosting support since she doesn't need any stats in particular. Although energy granting supports do have the best synergy with her as you'd probably expect, she manages to do quite well even without them thanks to her personal mechanics opening up a wider variety of avenues towards reaching those energy needs. Getting 72 energy directly from Sunday and HoYo's 20% max restored on ult is nothing to write off, but Core Resonance still gives her 24 energy per skill use or any ultimate. Because of this, although Branya isn't able to directly get Saber more energy, action advancing does contribute more to Saber's energy economy than most characters while being on a relatively accessible unit as a standard pool 5-star. Additionally, her talent's condition of generating points whenever an ally uses an ult is very flexible, giving her a wide array of excellent support options and opening the door for future partners to slot in. Currently, Saber is very favored for hypercarry setups because her skill is the best way to generate energy, thus requiring skill points and frequent actions. This is why her second ascension trace is able to help a little bit in that regard, giving her an extra skill point and full action advance when her next skill would charge her ultimate. Her enhanced basic also crucially generates a skill point, which is historically pretty rare, giving the team more breathing room. But if we were to ever get a future support that fires off frequent ultimates, they could potentially generate Saber energy faster than the current options, while also further boosting her skill's damage multiplier. Saber's kit has quite a bit of nuance to its mechanics that makes it more forgiving to play around than previous ultimate reliant units, and shows that some thought was put into how her teams might expand later down the line. It has depth, but at the same time is pretty straightforward in how you actually want to play her. Use skills to generate energy and fire off tons of ultimates. Perhaps the fact that some players with fresh accounts installed the game just to get Saber before she's potentially gone forever contributed to this, but regardless, just a solid design overall. I know the Fate collab event itself has been controversial to say the least, but I'm glad the collab units were able to deliver, seeing as how they are the part that people are spending money on. Unfortunately, I can't speak on how well they represent the franchise they're originally coming from as someone who isn't invested in the series at all, but in terms of 2 new characters added to Star Rail, their designs are very refreshing with how simple but effective they are. They prove that despite some aspects of the game's initial combat definitely becoming outdated, the original foundation still has room to be expanded upon. While the over-the-top stuff is still really cool and will help push future characters, straightforward and intuitive mechanics are still just as viable, at least for the time being. I hope you found this analysis interesting. Subscribe for more Star Rail discussion videos or join as a channel member to support me, and as always, thanks for watching.